One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things," they said. "Who gave you this authority?" He replied, "I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin?" They discussed it among themselves and said, "Well, if we say from heaven, he will ask, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered, "We don't know where it was from." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "God forbid." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written, 'The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people.
I just wanted to, as we're getting into Luke and kind of approaching, moving towards the end of the gospel narrative that Luke wrote, I want to set a little roadmap for you to let you know what's ahead for Emmaus in our time in Scripture. Tony and Anthony and I are excited about kind of this next season as we approach our 2-year anniversary. We spent the last almost 2 years studying the Gospel of Luke, but the plan is to finish the Gospel of Luke by the end of July, believe it or not. And then in August, we're excited about a series we want to do called Values. And just for the month of August, we're going to be talking about some of the core values that we hold as a people. So this won't be so much doctrine, it'll be more philosophical in the things that we believe in as a people, what we're to be about as a people. So the month of August, we're going to be in a series called Values. And then from there, we are going to do what I'm excited about, a survey of the 7 churches that the Apostle John wrote to in Revelation 2 and 3. And so those are kind of the things coming up as we approach the end of Luke, the last 4 chapters or so. We're intending to end by the end of July and then step into a couple of new series as we kick into our 2nd year as a people, as a church, as a family. So we find ourselves this morning in Luke chapter 20. Now, if you are a keen observer of biblical text, you're going to say something like, "Hey, you skipped a part, like you just skipped chapter 19, verses 28 through 48. And that is, of course, the story of when Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem. And we call that the triumphal entry. But if you recall back right around Easter time, on Palm Sunday, the Sunday before Easter, we actually went through this very text in a sermon we called Lament. So I would actually encourage you to listen to that because it specifically has to do with being emotionally healthy around the area of mourning loss. So some of you are here for that, but I would encourage you to look back if you weren't here for that, and that's Luke 19, verses 28 through 48, the subject of lament. So that being said, we've skipped forward to chapter 20, verses 1 through 19, and we're going to look at this morning, but just for context, just to remind you what's happening, Jesus and his disciples, his entourage, have officially made it into the city of Jerusalem. And what happens, as Rebecca read for us, as they enter into the city of Jerusalem, Jesus' authority is being tested or questioned. the religious leaders are questioning Jesus' authority. And in verse 2, we see his authority being questioned. Now, while in Jerusalem, since Jesus arrived there in his triumphal entry back in chapter 19, he's been teaching and ministering in the temple, which is the center of Jewish religious life. And it was there in the temple while Jesus was teaching that our text tells us that his authority was being questioned. And in great rabbinical style, Jesus answers a question with another question. They asked him by what authority he has to speak and do what he does. And then Jesus simply said, "Tell me, John the Baptist, by what authority did his baptism come from?" Knowing that that would put them on the horns of a dilemma, because if they said John's baptism was from God, well then he really had a trump card, right? Because John had validated Jesus. But if they said that his baptism, John's baptism, was from man, then they knew that the people would get angry and probably try to stone them to death because they all loved John. And so they said, "We don't know." And Jesus said, "Well then, I'm not going to tell you the answer to your question to me." Trump card. Jesus wins again. But as part of Jesus' answer to this question, by what authority do you do what you do? Do you say what you say? Jesus tells a story. When we think of the teaching ministry of Jesus, I think it's important to remember that Jesus was one who liked a good story. Often he would tell a story in order to get a point across. And I think it's good to remember that we are people of a story. And Jesus was the master as it concerned the telling of story. And so he tells a fictional story, we call them parables, to illustrate something that was spiritual in its nature. So his story then is to answer this question, by what authority do you do what you do? And this story is going to go right to the heart of the issue. And it's the story of the vineyard and the stone. It's sort of a two-in-one parable. The story of the vineyard and the stone. And the story that Jesus tells goes this way. There was a landowner who, as was common in that day, rented out his farm, his vineyard, to some what they called tenant farmers. That is, they lived on the land, they tended the land, but they did not own the land. And the landowner went away for a while and left his property, his vineyard, to be tended by these tenant farmers. But as was customary, the landowner would expect to reap the fruit, the benefit from the land that he had rented out to these tenant farmers. And so he sends one of his servants to go and collect the fruit around harvest time that he was due, being the owner of the land. And as Jesus tells the story, the tenant farmers, rather than give the servant the fruit that the owner deserved, they beat him and they sent him away empty-handed. And this happens not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 times the landowner sends a servant to go and collect fruit, and every time the tenant farmers beat him and send him away empty-handed. Until finally the vineyard owner says, "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to send my beloved son." Now are you starting to see a picture getting painted? There is a vineyard. There is an owner. There are people that are occupying, renting that space. They are mistreating the servants that the owner sends. And now the owner says, "They haven't listened to the servants. Now I'll send my son." But the text says, especially if you have some of the older translation, I believe it says beloved son. Now that should ring a bell, right? Jesus being the beloved Son of God. So now the owner sends out his beloved son to collect fruit from the tenant farmers, and the tenant farmers looked down in verse 14. When they saw that the son was coming, they said, verse 14, "This is the heir. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they conspired to do the worst thing that could have been done. They kill the landowner's beloved son. They threw him out of the vineyard and they slaughtered him. They killed him. But then comes the clincher of the story, verse 15. Jesus asks this loaded question. And this is sort of the pivot of the whole narrative as we come to verse 19. This little narrative here. This question, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? So now we've got a picture being painted. We've got a landowner who has been exceedingly patient with the tenant farmers, and they have abused everyone he has sent them, and then they killed his son. And then Jesus asks a pointed question: what do you think the landowner is going to do to those who slaughtered his own son? The answer, verse 16, he will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Now, this is not just a random story that Jesus is telling. This isn't a bedtime story about Goldilocks and the Three Bears and hope everybody just feels warm and fuzzy about the story. This story had some edges to it, an extreme point, and the religious leaders knew what the point was. Look down in verse 19. When they heard this story, the teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest Jesus immediately. Why? Because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. They knew his finger was pointed at them. This story is a fictional story to tell a prophetic lesson about what's about to transpire in the city of Jerusalem with the religious community. But the tipping point in this, as I said, this is a 2-for-1 parable. So Jesus tells the parable of the vineyard, then verses 17 and 18, he gives us the short parable of the stone. As verse 17 says, very confrontational. Jesus looked directly at them. Now he's making eye contact with these religious leaders as he spoke this prophetic story to them. And he says, what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you recognize that this is a prophetic text. This is a quotation from Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It's one of the most quoted Old Testament passages by New Testament writers. And here Jesus quotes that, looking directly at the religious leaders. He says, again, what is the meaning of this? The stone the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Then he adds, verse 18, everyone who falls on that stone, the rejected stone that has become the cornerstone, will be broken to pieces. And anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. Now, this is the 2-for-1 parable, the parable of the vineyard and the stone. The parable of the stone is important for a couple of reasons, for its context in the ancient world being one of them. In the ancient world, building took on very different material than it does in our day. In Jesus' day, they did not build with boards and nails like we do, but rather all the building and architecture was done primarily with stone. So the minute Jesus starts using stone language for buildings, everybody's tracking. Everyone could look around and see the temple and the buildings there in the city of Jerusalem, and they would note that buildings and stones. And so Jesus talks about the rejected cornerstone. Now, the cornerstone is a very important theological understanding. For in a building, the cornerstone, or as it's sometimes called, the capstone, was very important because it was sort of the finishing touch being put on a project. It was that last stone that was put on the top of two walls that joined together to complete the project. When the work was finished, the last finishing piece was to put on that capstone. And that would sort of seal the deal, finish the project. And so this understanding of the cornerstone, everyone understood in the building world that is the finishing touch. That is perhaps the most important stone of all stones because it holds together the entire building. Now, there is a very fascinating story, tradition, associated with the building of the temple that Jesus was actually in. But way back when Solomon built the first temple, the most epic of all the temples in Israel, there's the story about the building of Solomon's temple that had become sort of a legend of the day. And that is when Solomon was building his temple, sort of the rules of the building project were that all of the stones that would be used to build that massive temple had to be chiseled and hewn down in the rock quarry. Because there was not to be the sound of the chisel or any work or hammer on the Temple Mount where the temple would be built. So there was to be quiet and peace on the Temple Mount. So all the work was done in the valley below. And the precision of these rock masons, these stone masons, was such that literally when the stones were fitted together on the Temple Mount after being chiseled and formed in the rock quarry, they were done so exactingly when they were put together that they say you couldn't even fit a knife blade between the stones as they were stacked together. They fit together perfectly. Now, doesn't the scriptures, the Apostle Peter, talk to us about being living stones, fit together to build for God a house? And so, really, earth is the time in which God is chiseling and fashioning and forming us so that when we arrive in eternity, we'll fit together perfectly. There's going to be a gelling. There won't be division and fighting. The church is going to be God's house, being fashioned in the rock quarry earth, being prepared for eternity. And so all that to say, during the time of the building of Solomon's temple, there was this legend that there arrived on the Temple Mount a stone that did not seem to fit. They didn't see a place for the stone. They didn't know where this stone belonged. And so the people on the Temple Mount, they rolled the stone off the Temple Mount into the Kidron Valley. And as the building project was reaching its completion, they started looking around for the cornerstone. Where's the cornerstone? Where's the capstone? So they sent back down to the rock quarry and said, hey, send up the cornerstone. And the rock mason said, hey, we sent that up months ago. And then suddenly it dawned on the builders that that's the stone that we rejected. That's the cornerstone, the one that we rolled down into the Kidron Valley. And so Psalm 118 verse 22 is prophetic in the sense that it's something that goes back to historically the building of the temple. And now Jesus is saying, what does it mean to say that the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? The religious leaders knew that he was speaking of himself. Now, to back that up, if you've read more of your New Testament, you might recognize Psalm 118 verse 22 popping up several places. The Apostle Peter, when he was preaching about Jesus in Acts chapter 4, to the religious leaders, he quotes Psalm 118 verse 22 to point to Jesus Christ, our cornerstone. Peter, in his first letter to the church in 1 Peter, quotes Psalm 118 verse 22, again pointing to Jesus as the chief cornerstone. The Apostle Paul, in both Romans, his letter to the Romans, and his letter to the church at Ephesus, quotes directly from Psalm 118, verse 22, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. The religious leaders in Israel were looking at the very one who was the chief cornerstone, and they were about to reject him. This was prophetic. They had not done what they were going to do. They had not yet murdered the landowner's son. They had not yet pushed the chief cornerstone into the valley, rejecting him. Jesus was speaking ahead of time of what was about to come down in Israel. Now, there is another very interesting prophecy as it concerns the issue of a rejected stone that would eventually become the cornerstone. If you're familiar a little bit with the book of Daniel, and when Daniel was exiled into Babylon with his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they were there in Babylon, one night, the king at the time, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, has this dream. And he wakes from his sleep and he asks for someone to interpret his dream. But he also says, I'm not going to tell you what I dreamt. I need you to tell me what I dreamt and the interpretation thereof. And Daniel, being a seer from God, a prophet from God, one who knew how to interpret dreams, God gave him not only the king's dream, but the interpretation. And maybe you remember that dream in Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had. It was that dream of that giant statue that represented all the major empires of the world, the head of gold, the chest of silver, and the belly of brass. And they represented successive empires that would rule, and Babylon being the head of gold, and on it went. And Daniel chapter 2, Daniel interprets that dream for Nebuchadnezzar, but he said, but then in part of your dream, O Nebuchadnezzar, your nebbiness, part of this is that in the backdrop of this giant statue, which represented all the empires of the world from the head of gold to the feet of iron and clay mixed together with the 10 toes, there was in the distance a rock that was formed without human hands. And that rock began to roll down, and it collides with the statue and smashes it to smithereens. And then that rock, Daniel chapter 2, grows up to be a mountain that overtakes the earth. That's Jesus. That is an awesome prophetic story. So all of this is starting to play, and in the minds of the Jews, they understand buildings are with stone. Psalm 118:22, the cornerstone is important. And then the Daniel chapter 2, they're waiting for the rock formed without man's hands to come and overtake human government and overtake the world. Brothers and sisters, that's what we're waiting for. We're waiting for the rock formed without a man's hands, named Jesus Christ, to come and take over. He is the rock. Even the Apostle Paul said, the rock that followed Israel in the wilderness, that rock was Christ. You mean the rock they were drinking from? Yeah, that's Jesus. So one of the key identifying things about Jesus is Jesus is a rock. He's our rock. He's the rock that takes over human government. He's the rock from which we get refreshment, water. He is our stability. He is our foundation. And the Jews rejected the rock. They were about to reject the rock. And they knew after he makes this statement that it was them he was addressing these parables to. And he says this very ominous statement about the rock. Something you need to know about Jesus. He is the rock. He will take over. He is in charge. But then Jesus said about the rock the builders rejected. He said, the one who falls on this stone will be broken. But on whomever this rock falls upon, they will be crushed. Now think back to Daniel chapter 2, if you remember that prophecy. When that rock hit the statue, what happened? The statue was crushed to powder, and Daniel actually says the kind of powder that the wind can blow away like chaff. Just get that imagery. I wish someone would do it. Maybe one of you artists, since we value art here. Come on, artists. Do an image of the statue being smashed to smithereens and like chaff being blown away as the rock takes over the earth. That would be an awesome picture. And then we can put it up here and I can be like, hey, look at that. That's Jesus taking over. Awesome, right? So all that to say, there comes this clear awareness that Jesus is saying, right now I'm weak and vulnerable as I stand here as a man about to be crucified, the cornerstone about to be rejected, but I will be back. And when I come back, I'm taking over. That's the rock that you are building your life on. Sounds pretty awesome to me. Sounds pretty sturdy. Although it looks like Christianity is flimsy in the world, where there's people with different worldviews and ideologies that are arguing and fighting against Christianity, I'm saying, I don't know how this is all going to work out. I just know the rock's going to roll. And when he rolls, brother, sister, watch out. He's taking over. He's going to take over the earth. That's his agenda. He has an agenda. I'm going to take over the earth. I'm like, come on. Take over the earth, Lord. I'm waiting for that day. So Jesus talks, though, about something very important, and that is the consequences for resisting the rock. He says, first of all, in Israel, the vineyard tenant farmers, those who rejected the rock, the wrath of the vineyard owner would be against them. And then those rejecting the cornerstone, Jesus, they would be broken and crushed by the rock himself. So what is the message of this prophetic story? Other than a warning against those who would reject Jesus, is there something else? I think there is. Something that very much applies to the place that we find ourselves in as a people in this time in history. I believe that this is a prophetic story. This is a story about a covenant transition. Something is shifting in the gospel narrative. Something is changing. Jesus is ushering in something new. It's called the New Covenant, and in ushering in the New Covenant comes this prophetic story. So this vineyard story speaks of several things. It speaks of the nation of Israel, the prophets, Christ's rejection, and of the church. Did you pick all that up from the vineyard story? No. Well, I'm going to tell you how, hopefully clearly, how that this story, this little story, Jesus said this is of Israel, the prophets, the rejection of Christ, and the church that's to come. What's to be born out of this? So how does this story point to these things about this covenant transition that's happening, this shift that Jesus is ushering in? Well, first of all, the religious leaders, they would recognize this vineyard analogy. And if you're familiar with your Old Testament, maybe you're like, man, back in my Bible reading through the Bible in 1 year memory, I'm remembering something about a vineyard in one of the prophets. Well, yeah, good. Isaiah chapter 5. In Isaiah chapter 5, the nation of Israel is described as God's vineyard. So when the nation, when the religious leaders hear God speaking, Jesus speaking about a vineyard, their mind would automatically go back to Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, which says, "The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice," now this is interesting, "but saw bloodshed for righteousness, but heard cries of distress." This Isaiah 5:7 sounds a lot like the parable Jesus just told. That the people of Israel, the nation of Judah, they were God's vineyard. But when he came to look for justice and righteousness, he found nothing but bloodshed and cries of distress. So first of all, get your mind around the idea that the vineyard is a representation of God's covenant with Israel, or Israel itself. But then also in the story of the vineyard, this story of the vineyard doesn't simply represent the nation of Israel. It also primarily represents the covenant agreement that God had with the nation of Israel. And so to Israel and their religious leaders in particular, they are the tenant farmers in God's vineyard. I hope you see that. Because the religious leaders saw when Jesus was talking, the vineyard is a depiction of Israel. The tenant farmers then are those who were set in the vineyard to tend God's covenant, but they failed in their task. They were the ones left to watch the vineyard, but they did not do well. Thirdly, then, so we have the vineyard, God's covenant. We have the tenant farmers, Israel. Then thirdly, we have these servants. Who were the servants that the landowner sent out to collect fruit from his vineyard? They represent the prophets. And if you're aware of how the Jews treated their prophets, you're aware of the brutality. Actually, in Numbers chapter 14, we're told about Moses that they threatened and tried to stone Moses. Jewish tradition tells us that they put Isaiah the prophet in a dead tree trunk and sawed it in half. What a way to go. In the hollow of a log, and they saw you in half. Jeremiah the prophet, they threw him in dungeons several times before they finally stoned him to death. They killed Zechariah inside of the temple. You know, it's interesting, I was talking to my kids about this. They're like, that's great. When you love to be a fella. Conversations around my dinner table. One of my kids was like trying to look for something to do, and so I'm like, come down and help Dad study. So he was up looking like how the prophets were killed. That was his assignment, right? And he was telling me, "Oh, Dad, like it looks like they did something really brutal to this prophet." So I mean, part of this was a family effort. But I was talking to the boys in particular. I was like, we talk about like martyrs and the early apostles that were slain, but anyone who's a messenger from God is in jeopardy. The ancient prophets, they weren't treated well by their own people. And so the servant story, the story of the servants being sent out, is a story, an illustration of Jesus reminding Israel of how they've treated their prophets. Remember Jesus in that prophetic statement when he's weeping over the city of Jerusalem, he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who have" what? "Slain the prophets. How I would have gathered you like a mother hen gathers her chickens under her wing, but you would not. You didn't want anything to do with me." And so then, of course, we see that in the story as it's developing, now we have Israel, the vineyard, the tenant farmers, Israel, the servants, the prophets, and then, of course, the landowner being Yahweh himself, sending the son that he loves, and they cast him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. So maybe you see, as I do, what these religious people were seeing and hearing. They're like, we know you're talking about us. The question then of the hour is, as we go down to verse 15 and 16, this is where it gets relevant for the church. And that is this statement when Jesus says, what will the owner of the vineyard do, verse 15? He will come and kill the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Who are the others that Yahweh, the landowner, is going to turn the covenant over to? You can raise your hand. It's you. But here's what happens prophetically. Later, as we kind of continue on through the Gospel of Luke, we'll find in chapter 21, one of the things Jesus said prophetically in Luke chapter 21, verse 24, that Jerusalem is going to be trampled on by the Gentiles. So if you would, the physical land represents sort of a vineyard of sorts that God had entrusted to His people, that they did not treat well. They rejected God's loved Son, beloved Son. And so historically, here's what happens. In the year AD 70, the Romans, who are currently occupying the city of Jerusalem and running the nation of Israel, finally came in and sacked the city of Jerusalem, led by the Roman general Titus Vespasian. They went into the city of Jerusalem, and Titus specifically told all of the Roman soldiers, do not touch the temple. But one of the Roman soldiers shot a fiery arrow into the temple, and it caught the veil on fire. And so literally, all the gold in the ceiling of that ancient temple melted and went into the cracks of the stones. And so literally they tell us historically that every stone was pulled down, one stone by stone, stone upon stone, just as Jesus said, not one stone would be laid upon another. Because as the gold melted and went into the cracks of the stones in the temple, they were trying to extract the gold, so they had to pull down the stones, stone by stone, until finally the whole thing was leveled. Just as Jesus said it was going to be. Verse 16, again, that He would give the vineyard to others. Literally, Jerusalem was trampled by the Gentiles. Luke 21, verse 24. But it has more of an implication than just the Romans coming in and sacking the city and destroying the temple. If the vineyard represents God's covenant with His people, then the vineyard owner, God, turning the vineyard over to others, represents the new covenant that Jesus was ushering in for you and I, which we will celebrate as we eat and drink this morning, the new covenant. God has made a covenant with the church. The covenant has been extended beyond just Jews. The covenant is extended to us, the people called the church, both Jew and Gentile. This covenant note was established through the death of His Son, who was killed by the Jewish religious system, just as the story tells in the parable of the vineyard. So what does this mean? What does this mean for us in 2015, in the 21st century, in the American church? It means it's our turn to tend God's vineyard. The Father has turned the vineyard over to the church. It was once in the hands of the Gentiles, but they failed on their mission. And so now we have been given this opportunity. We are the others that verse 16 is referring to. We are the new tenant farmers in God's vineyard. This is our time to be fruitful, to work the harvest, and to be the people that God has intended for us to be in the world, to live in God's new covenant. Now, I want you to remember the context to which Jesus is speaking, because this is very applicable for those of us who believe that we are part of God's church and we are called under the new covenant to be the others that now take the vineyard. And that is this. In the ancient agrarian society, everyone was programmed for harvest. You worked all year, waited all year, prepared all year for that one window of time in the year where you would get all of your food. And if you failed at harvest, you failed to eat, you failed to survive as a people. So this society was programmed around the harvest. And when it was harvest time, everybody was preoccupied with the harvest. They had no other thing that could pull their attention away from the harvest, because the harvest was their vitality and their vibrancy. Actually, Solomon wrote about the harvest in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 25, when he said, "He that gathers in the summer is a wise son, but he that sleeps in harvest is a son that causes shame." So everybody in this society understood what it is to be preoccupied with the harvest. Now, brothers and sisters, I do believe Jesus speaks in this language other places that we are also to be a people who work His vineyard and are preoccupied with the harvest. Because like the parable that we just read, the owner of the vineyard expects fruit, expects some fruit from those who would be his tenant farmers. So a wise son, a wise daughter, a wise follower of Jesus is one who allows the harvest to preoccupy their heart. Rather than so much being pulled into all the things we do as American Christians, the reason you are on planet Earth, now that you have been given new humanity, now that you have a new heart, is primarily to work His harvest. To primarily say, how can I be as Jesus was, on a mission to find the lost, on a mission to reap fruit for His glory and His benefit, because that is what He's looking for. And this is our time to be fruitful, to work this harvest. And that was Israel's problem, is they were the Proverbs 10:25 son that sleeps in a harvest and causes shame. And they eventually ended up losing their vineyard. Israel had been called to reap the harvest around them. Literally, Isaiah 42 verse 6 says that God had established them to be a light to the Gentile nations. But what happened to Israel, we are very vulnerable to, and that is Israel became a religious club. They became an exclusive group. They liked each other. They liked their little safe club. They liked how they all agreed on everything. And so they really didn't want anybody else to join. This is our group. This is our club. This is our clique. We're comfortable. We don't want to let anybody else in. Forget Isaiah 42:6. We need to go be lights to the Gentile nations. Forget the fact that the Master has given you this vineyard to tend while He's away, but He expects fruit. They became an exclusive group that did not welcome in outsiders. And if we're not careful as a Christian church, that can be a tendency for a church to go inward and not be outward. Because we like each other. I like the fact that we affirm each other's beliefs and practices, and that we all kind of pat each other on the back and good job and that's right and exactly what you said and all of that. We're comfortable with each other. We can often be enjoying our little group. We'd like to just keep it that way. But Jesus is looking for a reaching church, a fruitful church, a church that shares the good news, a hospitable church. And by God's grace, I believe we are a people that have been programmed that way. I really feel that. I feel that that is one of the core values of Emmaus, that we are a people not about ourselves. And that's why we use missional language all the time, because we believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ has called us to the nations, called us to our local neighborhood, called us to our workplaces, not to simply exist for a group that exists for itself, but rather to be a hospitable people, a people who enjoy finding the lost and the least. But let me tell you something about that. When a church turns the corner and they're no longer an exclusive club, it gets really messy. Because if you bring people in that don't fit your ideology or your worldview, there are some messes. You know that? You start bringing people in that have alternative lifestyles and different ways of viewing things. It'd be much easier on all of us to just embrace people that embrace what we embrace. But the fruitful church is a church that says, we want to go out and reap the harvest for the glory of the King. And we expect it to be messy and bloody work, but it's worth it because it's what we've been called to. We want to be a reaching people. I believe the church that Jesus came to build is to be a healing station, a hospital, an emergency room where the wounded come when they cannot go anywhere else. Such a great thing whenever you meet someone who's come into your community and they say, I couldn't find any other place to go. This was my last resort. Now we might say, it should have been your first resort, but I'm glad that when no one else would take you in, we would. That we wouldn't be the place that has like some long laundry list of things you must do to fit into our society. No, come on in. Drink the water. Come on in and taste and see that the Lord is good. Come be a part of a people who will not accept you in the sense that will tolerate every goofball thing that you do, but we're a people that say, come just as you are, but don't stay that way. But we expect that when people come just as they are, it's going to be messy at first, but God will change them. This is not my job to change people. It's not yours either. It's our job to say, good news, come on in. The free love of God is available to you. It doesn't matter who you are, what color your skin, where you come from socioeconomically. Doesn't matter your background, what you're doing, what you've done, what you look like. Doesn't matter. You come in, and we believe Ezekiel 36 that Jesus will take out the heart of stone and replace it with the heart of flesh, and then He'll be able to write on your heart, and you'll start dropping sins like hot rocks. That's what happened to me. I mean, quite frankly, like no one gave me a lecture on like, hey, Brian, you shouldn't be smoking dope. You should be listening to this really foul Bone Thugs and Harmony, like gangster rap, right? Like I was talking with some of the guys this morning, and they have me all pegged wrong. They think I was like into Boys to Men, like all this romantic stuff. I'm like, no, brothers, like I was into the mean gangster violent rap, like the manly side of carnality, right? Like, yeah. But no one needed to tell me when I was rolling in my Chevy Impala that, hey, you probably shouldn't be listening to that, because I was so grieved because I had a new spirit within me. Like, wait, like Alice in Chains, they're not speaking about Jesus. Like, why am I bumping this stuff? Like, why am I listening to all these guys, and why am I participating? It just started dropping from my life. And I believe that as the church becomes more of a saving station, a place where we say, come just as you are, and you won't stay that way. I just believe that. And we don't have to have some legalistic weird thing, like list of do's and don'ts. We preach the Bible. We love people. We believe in the conviction of the Holy Spirit to change lives. That's what we believe. So we say, you want to get water baptized? As God is changing your life? Yes, let's go. If you haven't been water baptized, we would love to join you in your journey and have you go take that plunge in water to physically demonstrate a life that's been altered by Jesus Christ. If you have not been water baptized, I don't know why I'm talking about this, but I am. I would say, hey, look, like this is the way in which we demonstrate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so, I look forward to being a harvesting people. A people that are about working the vineyard for the glory of the one who has given us this vineyard to work. And it's going to get messy. It won't be neat or tidy, but it's a place where people will be saved from their sin, healed, restored, and redeemed. And that's being in God's vineyard. It's our time. Our time is now. It won't be like this forever. The owner of the vineyard is going to come back. And when He comes back, our time to work the vineyard will be over. I want to end with this story. I don't agree with everything that this particular brother preaches or believes, but I like a lot of what he's about, and that is a pastor named Tony Campolo. And he tells this story, very, very compelling story, about a time in his life where he was having to work a second job, and ministry just wasn't paying. And the job he took was in kind of a shady part of New York, I believe it was, or Philadelphia, one of those places. And he was working graveyard. And one particular night, it was kind of his custom that during his break at 3 a.m., he'd go down to this little shady diner, little greasy spoon, and have a cup of coffee for his 15-minute break. And so one particular evening, or morning as it were, 3 a.m., he's down there having his cup of coffee, and he overheard a conversation between these two prostitutes, because this little greasy spoon was kind of an attraction point for bums and prostitutes and pimps and just shady folk, right? So he's there, he's just having his cup of coffee, Pastor Tony Campola, and no one knows he's a pastor. He's just drinking this really bad cup of coffee and 3 a.m., right? He's probably thinking, what's my life about? And he overhears this conversation between these two prostitutes in the booth just over from him, and one of them mentions that the next day was her birthday. So when they left, he got up and walked over to the chubby cook, Harry, or whatever his name was. He said, hey, look, like I heard that the prostitute over here, she comes here every morning, I'm here, and tomorrow's her birthday. So what do you say we throw her a birthday party at 3:30 in the morning? The chubby guy's like, yeah, that's awesome. Called his wife out. She said, I'll bake the cake. Tony Campola said, I'll bring the party streamers, the whole thing. So just like clockwork, 3 o'clock, Tony Campola's there. But apparently word had got out, so every bum and pimp and prostitute and just all like the margins of society were packed into this little Greasy Spoon diner to celebrate Agnes's birthday, the prostitute. And just like she always did at 3:30, she walked in and everybody shouted happy birthday and they broke into song, and she sat down on a stool, her eyes just full of tears, and then they brought out the birthday cake, all the candles on it and the whole thing, and she just broke down and started weeping. They were like, "What's wrong, Agnes? Why are you weeping?" She said, "It's not because I'm sad, it's because I've never had a birthday party before." Just as they were about to cut the cake, she said, "Can we just hold on for a second? Can we just not cut this cake because I need to go show it to my mother. I just live right down the road." And so she walked out, tears streaming down her face, with her first ever birthday cake at 39 years old, this prostitute, right, in inner city somewhere. And as she walks out, the place just goes silent. The pimps, the prostitutes, the bums, the wild crowd. And Pastor Tony Campola stands up and basically leads them in a prayer meeting, right? He's like, "Man, like, this is awesome. Like, we're having a prayer meeting with pimps and prostitutes and bums at 3:30 in the morning." And just as he was about to leave to go back to work that morning, Harry, the guy behind the counter, was like, "Hey, man, I didn't know you were a preacher. What church do you pastor?" And he goes, "I belong to the church that there was birthday parties for prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning." And Harry said, "I'd go to a church like that. Even I'd go to a church like that." And that is essentially the story of Jesus. When he walked the earth, the company that he kept caused the religious community to raise their eyebrows, to wag their heads, and to strongly disagree with the tax collectors, the publicans, the prostitutes, and the shady folk that he did dinner with. His dinner company was not of the best reputation, but that was the mission of Jesus. And such were some of you. On some level of society, whether you were white-collar sinner or dirty scoundrel blue-collar sinner or anywhere in between, we were all in some shape where Jesus said, "I would have dinner with you," even when no one at church would. Even with all the good people, they wouldn't want anything to do with you. But Jesus said, "You can roll with me and my posse. If you don't fit anywhere in society, you fit here. This is the one place you always fit. You don't have to ask permission. You fit here." And brothers and sisters, I believe that this parable is wanting all of us to take a relook at the way in which we are approaching our lives and saying, "Jesus, I've been placed in your vineyard with this community. So let's be an inviting group of people." You are an inviting group of people. Let's just turn it up a couple of notches and say, this is what we're all about. We are a people preoccupied with the harvest. We are a people who say, if I don't know how to preach the gospel to people, I know how to invite them. Will you come dinner at my house? You want to have coffee? You want to meet me at church? I'll buy you lunch afterwards. Whatever I got to do to leverage this. Birthday parties at 3:30 a.m. Come on. Whatever I got to do to go out and say, I just want to love and show people what this vineyard that Jesus has called us to manage is really all about. That there would be fruit coming from the vineyard that Jesus has planted and cares deeply about. We're just workers in this vineyard, and it's an exciting thing. It's our time, brothers and sisters. While we are living, it's our time to work the vineyard. It's our time. In Jesus' name, let's pray.